All right. I think we're going to get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session that's entitled People Power for Peace, Addressing Fragility and Violent Extremism Through Civil Resistance. My name is Maria Steffen, and I direct the program on nonviolent action at the U.S. Institute of Peace. I'm really excited to be with you all today and to introduce this topic of people power and violent extremism. We've heard a lot of conversation over the past couple of days about the need to emphasize grassroots approaches to peace building and preventing violence and violent extremism. And I think the conversation today is going to hone in on a particular type of grassroots activity that civil resistance, which involves nonviolent direct action tactics like boycotts, protests, strikes, vigils, lots of different forms of direct action to address the drivers of violent extremism and to help provide some of the same psychosocial benefits that violent extremist groups have. I think also there's, at the U.S. Institute of Peace, we have been supporting a task force on extremism in fragile states. And one thing that my colleague Leanne Erdberg and I have been trying to emphasize as part of that high-level process is really the need to center not only local actors, but grassroots actors who engage in this type of collective action that uses kind of more propulsive direct action tactics. So we're going to talk a little bit about the relevance of nonviolent civil resistance to addressing the drivers of violence and violent extremism, and we're going to talk about some of the policy ramifications of taking people power seriously in the context of preventing violent extremism. So we have a wonderful group of panelists to kick off the conversation. I am going to introduce them each briefly, and they're going to offer a few minutes as in kind of an initial framing of the conversation. I will then ask the panel a couple of questions, one or two, and then we are going to leave plenty of time for discussion and conversation with you all. So the person who's going to kick off the conversation today is Hardy Merriman. Hardy is the president of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, which is an organization dedicated to developing and disseminating knowledge and know-how about waging nonviolent struggle strategically. Hardy is a longtime friend and colleague of mine. He's a trainer and educator, author of numerous publications on civil resistance and strategic nonviolent action, and we're happy to have Hardy with us. Speaking after Hardy will be Nilüfer Saki. Nilüfer is a lecturer on global conflict analysis and resolution at George Mason University. And interestingly, Nilüfer has been involved in the Afghan peace process now for a number of years, and she's going to be speaking specifically on the Afghan case study and the relevance of grassroots actors in challenging violent extremism and advancing the peace process. And my colleague at the U.S. Institute of Peace, Leanne Erdberg, who directs our program on countering violent extremism at U.S. Institute of Peace. I have thoroughly enjoyed working with Leanne because she's very much about busting silos and challenging the restrictive paradigms and frameworks that are kind of reducing creative options for preventing violent extremism. She comes from a very strong policy background, having held positions at both the State Department and the National Security Council. So I think we've got an interesting mix of perspectives to engage with you all today on this topic. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Hardy Merriman to give us a conceptual framework for civil resistance and countering violent extremism.
Thanks, Maria. Thank you also to the United States Institute for Peace for organizing and convening this panel and asking me to be here. And thanks to all of you, special people who want to come to a panel on addressing violent extremism on a Friday afternoon. It's awesome turnout. Right on, guys. Commitment. That's great. So we're going to go straight into the lightning round. I got 5 minutes, so I will keep it tight, and we'll talk more in the Q&A. basically my work focuses on looking at grassroots nonviolent movements around the world, trying to figure out why some succeed and why others fail at securing human rights, justice, and democracy. And my particular emphasis of my work is on strategy, what kind of strategies work and what kind of strategies don't. So when we're talking about addressing violent extremism, we're talking about obviously a very highly complex problem and challenge that people have been trying to look at from different angles for, at this point, decades. And therefore, I'm going to set the bar low for myself. If what I say, if you are convinced by the end that what I'm saying can account for even 10% of a way to solve this problem, I think I'm doing pretty well. Because obviously, any solution requires a lot of different approaches. So I'm going to try to just advance one. And we can look at this problem from two angles, right? The push factors, what are the environmental and structural conditions that can drive people towards violent extremism? And then the other angle is, what are the pull factors? What are the factors that violent actors are using to try to recruit and bring people into their ranks? And I'm going to just share a conceptual frame for how I think nonviolent civil resistance and nonviolent movements can try to address both of those. And I want to start with a few just sort of facts about nonviolent civil resistance. And some of these come from the great work that Maria Stephan has done as a researcher and scholar in this field. And so the first fact is that based on quantitative research, when we look at hundreds of nonviolent and violent movements over the 20th century, we see that nonviolent movements achieved, well, let me qualify this. These are all movements that are trying to create a political transition, generally operating in a non-democratic environment. We see that nonviolent movements, on average through the 20th century, achieved a political transition 53% of the time. Success rate for violent movements, insurgency, was 26% of the time. So right there, it's a really sort of groundbreaking finding. It came from the 2011 book that Maria and Erica Chenoweth co-authored, where we're finding nonviolent movements that are generally encountering non-democratic contexts were twice as effective in creating political transition as their violent counterparts. Now, that leads to the next question. What kind of outcomes do those movements produce? We've now had, by my count, at least 7, if not 8 major studies that have looked at what happens after nonviolent transitions driven by civil resistance, and every single one of them finds that there's a relatively high prospect for democracy post-transition than other means of struggle. So far higher probability of democracy after a nonviolent movement than you get, say, from a violent insurgency, from a top-down peace process after a war, or other means of transition or foreign intervention. We also see after transitions driven by nonviolent movements that they have higher economic growth and tend to have higher rates of improved public health. We also know about nonviolent civil resistance that it is effective not just at driving political transitions, but also curtailing corruption, achieving a variety of rights-based claims, including women's and minority rights, helping to overcome economic and social marginalization, and even in some cases helping to achieve self-determination of populations. We've even seen it used not just against states, but against violent non-state actors, everything from the mafia to armed groups in Colombia, to Maria's done great documentation of cases of nonviolent action used against ISIS and other terrorist or insurgent groups. And the last point I want to make about it before I get into the model, which I have 1 minute to do, is just what the research tells us so far is that nonviolent movements, the strategy matters a great deal. They're not just driven by structural conditions. They don't emerge just in certain kinds of contexts and win in certain kind of contexts. In fact, we've seen that they emerge in really challenging contexts, as armed insurgencies do, and they can win even in spite of tough odds. And there's a number of studies that really show that the typical structural conditions that people assume would prevent a nonviolent movement from being effective actually don't determine it completely. Skill and strategy matter. So one way to think about this is simply when nonviolent movements do well, it tends to reduce push factors, drivers, corruption, marginalization, bad governance, and so forth, that can drive people into violent extremism. And so one thing we can get to in Q&A is, well, what does that mean for external actors, queuing in on how these movements succeed, what causes them to succeed, and whether external support can boost their chances of success. The other point I want to make has to do with the pull factors, how they can actually undercut the recruiting and marketing of violent extremism as a way to solve problems. And here, if I could just have 30 seconds, I would say there's basically a supply and a demand issue, right? So in places where violent extremism is on the offer, it's clearly there to meet a demand that people have. They might have that demand because they're young men looking for a sense of power. They might have that demand because of a sense of deep marginalization or various other reasons, but there is a demand for some means of struggle, some means to feel powerful, some means to feel part of something and feel that you have a future and that you're doing something that many who, you know, enlist may think is virtuous. Okay, so there's that demand, and then there's the supply. There's the product on the shelf they can reach for. And if that option is basically a monopoly of violent insurgency, this is what you do if you really feel these things strongly enough. We're not going to get rid of that by criticizing it. We're not going to get rid of that by saying that's a bad choice. We're not going to get rid of it by saying, well, we should really find peaceful solutions unless we can give people an alternative way to meet that demand. Unless we can put something different for them to reach for and also promote it and market it. Sorry, I don't want to push the metaphor too far. I'm not trying to bring capitalism or any of the economics into the debate too much, but I think it's just a useful piece about how this stuff is marketed because it meets a demand. And I have a whole bunch of thoughts about how nonviolent civil resistance can be marketed to actually compete for people, so that when they reach various decision points, which is a subtle and slow process, from saying, what is this, to I'm interested, to now I want to be part of this, that there is a counterpoint for them that at various points they can check in on and think, maybe I want to go in a different path. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks so much, Hardy, for those kind of framing remarks and just emphasizing the real power of the civil resistance frames is that it offers an effective and powerful means of individuals, including those who are in highly repressive, corrupt societies, to address grievances, fight for justice, but without use of violence. So the provision of an alternative, I think, is a really powerful contribution of this frame to the conversation on CVE. So we'll now hone in on a very specific case study, and some of you may have been kind of interested in the new dynamics that have been emerging in Afghanistan. Obviously, peace process stalled, many problems, continuation of violence, but there have been kind of sparks of hope, especially within the past few months, with kind of a grassroots challenge after a very dangerous a deadly Taliban attack, and kind of a new bubbling of civic pressure demanding peace and challenging extremism. And so Nilüfer is going to tell us a bit about what has been happening with the grassroots in Afghanistan.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank USIP and Alliance for Peacebuilding for having me here. I would like to start, but just for the information, for the major framework, Afghanistan is in the process of peace process. So it is, I don't want to show any glossy face at this stage because we don't know the result of the process. It's happening. It's right now even the elite or a top level approach is really happening in the region between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and among Afghanistan and different regional actors. So the top level is happening, negotiation processes are happening. I'm going to focus more on my personal experience with dealing of grassroots activism and mobilization for peace since 2011, and if there has been really a grassroots movement or no, my own analysis and then my personal work through different capacities that I have been in Afghanistan, would like to focus on that. I think in Afghanistan, grievances has been the major cause of creating or establishing a movement. So rather in different peace studies, we study that grievances are causes of caused by unmet basic human needs, are source of aggression and frustration. But in Afghanistan, it has been reversed in this process. The grievances has been proved to be a positive step towards people mobilization and movement for peace, because when they see that their needs are not met, especially the security needs, when they see their security needs are not met either by the government or the other factions, they mobilize and they group themselves and create collective movement for change. I think that is one thing I wanted to focus here, especially in recent movement in Helmand, a bomb attack killed many and injured many, and then the victims of that particular incident grouped together and created a collective movement. So grievance is a cause of positive inspiration for people rather than a negative impact on their movement. So that's one point. The second thing that I wanted to make a point here, that since 2011 onwards, there hasn't been really people's movement. Means that there has been a lot of international funding through civil society organization with the hope to create that movement. So it was not an indigenous step to take for the peace, rather than it's an outside approach of mobilizing people for peace, which has been proved positive. So a number of activities like through APRP and Afghanistan Peace and Reintegration Program, and many local civil society organizations who created working on trauma healing, nonviolent movement, educating, radio station for peace around the country, and working through universities, religion through peace. So there were all these different elements that created with communities, with villagers, with the religious elders. It created a movement. I mean, these activities were source of creating and mobilizing people for what's really happening around you, and now you need to stand up and ask for something change. So these efforts has proved to be positive, according to my personal experience with this program, which has reached to the very remote areas of Afghanistan, and has been the result. And the result we see now, that the Helmand peace movement, or Badakhshan peace movement, or Mazar peace movement, is a result of all those pieces of work which has been launched in Afghanistan through civil society, through international actors from 2011 onwards. And the concept of non-violence, because initially in 2011 we have seen that this movement were turned into violence. And the youth and even people from different factions, they started fighting on ethnicities, on religion, on Shia Sunnis at the end of these movements, at the end of this protest. But now that has changed. Now there's all peace education, there's all peace through religion, and all these pieces of work which has been launched through years has changed the notion of this protest and movement overall, and it has become more non-violent. It has replaced the violent action of people throughout this time. The other aspect that I want to mention is that peace movement, I mean, based on my experience in Afghanistan and work on different projects, in contexts like Afghanistan, I mean, peace movement should not be confined to boycotts, protest, vigils, or many other things. It should be a systematic approach of changing the socio-political landscape. And for that, the Helmand protest could be used as a framework. Why? Because recent Helmand protests could not bring a substantive change in the peace process in general. The Taliban disagreed with them, and Taliban rejected their demand. The government of Afghanistan did not, paid any attention. So overall, the impact of Helmand was really not very positive, but the process was interesting because process created linkages among different provinces, and the ethnic divide that was in the country, it addressed that. So it started from a Pashtun-led, which is a particular ethnicity in Afghanistan, Pashtun-led area, and the movement moved to different Tajik-led area and the other, and people joined them because of the similar grievances. So they had all the security concern, they have all lost their family members, so they all joined. I mean, regardless of what ethnicity and religion they had, the movement was able to attract different factions of society. And I think such movement and such context could be used as a platform of reconciliation. And that could be really, really, impactful in that. And I hope that this Helmand peace movement could happen, and could extend its activities, because it has the potential of creating that reconciliation and ethnic divides, which has led to instability currently, and which has impact on the peace process also. So, and activities like that could, and then the other point, how this, a lesson from this Helmand peace process is that individuals within this movement, the movement leaders, movement actors, should not only limit themselves with certain protests around, but they should target all the societal factors that could lead to success. And societal factors means they should interact closely and have close coordination with peace councils and provinces. They should work with the local institutions. They should work with the religious elders. They should not limit themselves to the protests and walks only. They should go beyond that in order to attract more allies from the society and change the perspective about the entire process. So that is, it might take time. It's a time-consuming. The movement might not result a temporary solution, but I think it has the potential to grow that large grassroots peace movement, non-violent movement within different factions in society. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Nilüfer, and just honing in on the importance in this case. Well, first, the interesting emergence of a nascent grassroots movement, and just the point of being able to go from the protests and the tactics and campaigns to movement building, and what that might mean for helping to transform the situation and kind of advance the peace process in Afghanistan, and what does that mean to support a movement building approach in the country. So thank you very much, Nilüfer. So last to give some framing remarks is Leanne, and she has been in the trenches of a lot of policy, high-level policy conversation about various approaches to countering violent extremism, and I think has an interesting take on the relevance of this approach, people power, civil resistance, to more of the prevention frame of violence, violent extremism. So Leanne, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you to AFP for the third wonderful day of PeaceCon this year, and thank you to all of you for being the after lunch session and still showing up, so thank you. So the frame that I think would be useful for our discussion for me to share around countering violent extremism and nonviolent resistance is really one about pushing the envelope of what does top-down and bottom-up really have to offer for this. So a lot of countering violent extremism frameworks over the last 5 to 10 years have really been defined by outsiders. And I don't mean this in a necessarily pejorative way, but when we think of who is identifying the grievances and then who is providing the interventions for those grievances, it is often an outside actor, including at times the national level government, but many times the international actors. So when we think about the diagnosis of the push and pull factors that Hardy was mentioning, usually that diagnosis is being done by outsiders. And what I think that, so the first point that I want to make is I think nonviolent resistance offers a really important paradigm shift, that those who are locally based and experiencing those grievances are defining those grievances for themselves, and they are telling others that this is an injustice, or that this is a governance deficit, that this is an economic marginalization challenge. They're the ones who are defining it. The second part of that paradigm that I think is important for this intersection of two different discourses is also along the same lines but slightly different, which is, okay, so what are we going to do about it? So a lot of countering violent extremism interventions, which there have been some really interesting panels over the last couple of days, are really thought of in the medical sense of an intervention. What can we do about the problem that we're experiencing? And what I think what nonviolent resistance does is it gives a process instead of a solution. And so in this space, you're able to have individuals who have defined what their own grievances are, and then you are allowing them to say, and this is what we want to do about it. We want to go for political change. We would like to see more representation here. We would like to see a variety of different outcomes, but the process by which they do it is through nonviolent organizing. And then the third point that I want to make about this, why I think it's a really important intersection, is both Maria and Hardy mentioned it, but I'm going to foot stomp it, which is the importance of being part of a group. A lot of what we see in terrorist radicalization and recruitment is about the ideas that these organizations are spreading. The ideas are sometimes obscure the importance of what it's like to be a young man, part of a band of brothers, with others who are on a shared moral mission, and we struggle together, we act together, we live together, we do everything together, and that we are perhaps undervaluing what it means to be part of a shared mission and a shared identity. And I think civil resistance allows for an alternative outlet for that, which, by the way, as Maria's research has proven, happens to be more effective if what you're really trying to do is make a political change. And so maybe that's the last point that I'll make on the framing of this discussion, which is we sometimes in the international community, because of the sheer inhumanity of a lot of terrorist actors and the ways in which they are so vicious and so violent, we sometimes forget that they're also very political actors, that they are saying to a group of people every single day, the status quo is unacceptable, those responsible for the status quo is unacceptable, and only I can deliver something different for you. And so those are very political objectives, and so we don't always think about also solving them in a different political vector. How can I join something that will also be able to, I don't want to deny the fact that some of the exact grievances that terrorist organizations then twist and warp into their own narrative are not there, because in a lot of places these injustices are extremely rampant. But what you do about those injustices is really the question that I think brings these two fields really squarely together. So I think in terms of framing, I think it's really useful for the countering violent extremism and counterterrorism community to start looking at, when we talk about preventing violent extremism, it's not just addressing the push and pull factors, but is what are positive alternatives before push and pull factors are even factored in. So,
thanks very much, Leanne. So I think those were three very helpful interjections to frame the conversation. And I wanted to just probe the kind of the idea that you raised and Hardy raised earlier of joining groups and the whole idea of the psychosocial benefits of joining movements and being part of resistance campaigns and initiatives. And I wanted to ask Hardy, and in a little bit it's going deeper into your notion of marketing and what does it mean to effectively market civil resistance. And could you just talk a little bit about kind of the motivational factors and kind of what encourages people to join movements in the first place, and what would it mean to effectively market civil resistance, to individuals who are in contexts where they may be motivated to join extremist groups or terrorist groups?
Great, thank you, Maria. Well, one thing that the research tells us when we look at why people might join a nonviolent campaign or a nonviolent movement is that friends are the best recruiters, right? So I might be aware of a campaign, but if I don't know anyone in the campaign, there's a high psychological threshold for me to hop over to decide I'm going to show up not knowing anyone and be like, it's me, guys, it's me. I want to join. The minute I know someone, it's a lot easier. And I think this is sort of sets up a cycle, because you know someone, you get in, you meet other friends, and then it becomes your community. I would encourage those of you who, to interview some activists in nonviolent movements in the U.S. or abroad and talk about what it's meant to them to be in a movement. And there's no shortage of times where it can be depressing and a whirlwind, but there are lots of people, especially when they get back and reflect on what they've done as part of a nonviolent movement, that it's clear that there can be emotion in their voice even after 10 or 20 years as one of the most meaningful or powerful things that they did. So it's clear to me, and I don't have studies on this, but based on my interaction with activists, that there's something deep that can happen to people. And it's not just what happens to people through saying, okay, in this space, look, society might be a mess out there, but in this space today, we're going to give ourselves space to imagine and then strategize and then build. Just that can be quite powerful. But then there's also something in the actual doing. You can only get so far through talk, and then once you actually do, and you say, okay, I butted up against my fear, I butted up against what I thought would or would not be possible, and I realized that that was a misconception. Or maybe I realized actually it really wasn't possible too. I mean, I don't want to get too starry-eyed here. I mean, but I think the transformation's not just in the talking, it's not just in the relationship, it's also in the doing. And I think at their best, nonviolent movements can offer all of those things. You bond not just through the words, not just through sharing the space, but also through sharing the experience of acting together. I could go on, but I think I'll stop there. I'll say one other thing just to maybe get into the marketing issue more, but I would point out that I don't know of a culture around the world that has not had nonviolent campaigns and movements. They may not have called them that. They may not have used those words. But I don't know of a country, nation, culture that has not had boycotts and strikes. We all, as children, understand that we can nonviolently shift our behavior patterns and make life for our parents very challenging. It's very basic in human psychology. And it's not something that, it's something that we do forget, but it's also something we can remember. So this doesn't have to be a mystical phenomenon or some, special, as the authoritarians would have you believe, some black box that's brought in by the CIA, like an imported revolution. This is just fundamental to human psychology. And then this fundamental insight becomes something that becomes activated collectively in a strategic way when we're a little older, that can be used to achieve real political purpose.
Great. Thanks very much, Hardy. Just getting at the element of parenting and the power of collective stubbornness in certain cases, which can be alluring to, again, people who are facing profound injustices and grievances in their society. And the sense of empowerment and solidarity that is born of participation in nonviolent movements, I think, is a really powerful point. So Nilüfer, back to the psychosocial dimensions of the Afghanistan case. Can you speak a little bit more about the motivational factors? So what prompted people to join kind of the Helmand March and the Mazar marches, and what can you say about what would keep them involved and engaged? So kind of the psychosocial dimensions of the bubbling peace movement in Afghanistan.
I think shared experiences and shared grievances. It really make people join the Helmand Peace March, which started from Helmand, and they, especially the last year, the last 2017 till now 2018 mid, violence has increased a lot in Afghanistan, and there was at least average of 2 attacks in a week, 1 attack in a week every week. So that, I think, made people join the movement in general. And on the other hand, not seeing any substantive change in their life conditions. That was another thing. They're tired. They are leaving the country. They are just selling their properties all over from just to get rid of the country and leave the country. And most the families, they are losing their children, their school-going children, because schools were under target, and universities and colleges were under target, and 2 university attacks. So there were all these factors of joint grievances, shared grievances, especially related to security, that people joined the protests, and also other protests started in different parts of the country, and seeing certainly no result in the situation, because people were very hopeful initially in 2011 that something is going to happen within 2 years, something is going to happen within 3 years. And psychosocial, from neuroscience perspective, you get tired. At some point you want to either stand up, so frustrated, or that frustration will turn into aggression, or no, that aggression, in case of this protest, I mentioned that, thank God, it didn't turn into aggression, but it turned into something positive. Let's collect and do something positively. Or, and the third step that Afghans are adopting right now, let's leave the country. So there are 3 things they're doing. Let's leave the country, or be aggressive and do something against the regime, or let's gather together and start pushing and campaigning for change. That these 3 steps they have been utilizing from 2011, and they are now pushing a lot from the push is coming really from grassroots because of the shared grievances and no substantive change in life conditions.
It's interesting, and also your point about people getting tired. I think a lot of the youth-led and other movements, it's it's not by mistake that they entitle their movements like "I am tired" and "Enough," like Kifaya, Yana Mar, Anna Taban in South Sudan. Like, people just fed up with violence, saying enough and organizing around it. So and the slogan
of Helmand process was enough war. That was the slogan that they have been using on a white brag on their foreheads and their flags. So enough of war. That was the slogan they started with. It means they were extremely tired of it.
Very interesting. And so, Leanne, how would you draw it a little bit more? And it's interesting that Hardy mentioned the lack of data on kind of what motivates people to join terrorist groups compared to nonviolent movements, which is something we've begun to explore at USIP. So, kind of, what would you want to add additionally on the point of kind of the motivational psychosocial dimensions.
A couple of things that I perhaps would want to add. One is the perception of power is such an important part of how terrorist groups recruit. That they are the David and Goliath story is very, very real in so many of the ways, and because of their tactics, they have outsized import in a lot of political arenas. So this perception of power, I think, is a really important part of, like, on the recruitment side for a lot of terrorist groups. What that means for nonviolent resistance is the perception of, I mean, the word empower to me speaks so fluidly to nonviolent resistance. How are we actually empowering people? Some of the stuff I was saying earlier, I maybe didn't use like all the words that I normally do with this, but like being part of a group that's actually trying to accomplish something gives people such a sense of dignity in the work that they are doing, a sense of meaning and purpose. And I think that those, from a neurological and chemical perspective, I'm sure they would bear out. And I'm hoping that our research at USIP is going to look at some of these components to it. I think that there is also a real sense of agency, and I kind of said this a little bit earlier, but like the idea that you and the group of people that you are a part of are looking to solve something together, and we get to define it, and it's not told onto us, I think is a really important part of this as well, that I am also pretty certain would bear out in some of the psychological pieces. The last part that is probably worth mentioning, because I think it's a real unknown, is there's a lot of study of terrorist groups as being both the violent part and the adventure-seeking part as being a really critical component. And I think that there's something for those of us who are committed to the nonviolent resistance side to understanding what are the human components that are triggered by that. Is it propensity for dehumanization? Is it propensity for frankly, for groupthink, for group identity? As you were saying earlier, like friends are the best recruiters. This is rampant in almost every type of terrorist recruitment that we see, is that you join, whether it's an online friend or an offline friend, that it is incredibly important that there's somebody who believes very deeply in your reason for joining. And I think that there's something there that can be tied to some of perhaps the adventure seeking, and the violence comes later, but it's the group manifestation that comes first. So I think there are places in both the neuroscience and behavioral science that we can learn from. But I think, to Hardy's point, like, I think we should do more interviewing of people and really hear from individuals what they're feeling, thinking, and experiencing, because I think a lot of it is very replicable, and as Maria's book has shown, much more effective. And I think we don't, from the advertising perspective, like, we don't talk about that enough in the context of countering violent extremism. But I think Afghanistan is looking to be the place where it's going to be most apparent.
A lot of potential for research. So now the final part of the panel discussion before we turn it over to Q&A with you all gets at the policy and practitioner ramifications of this conversation. So Hardy, kind of what's the so what for policymakers? What types of outside support would actually be helpful in supporting these types of nonviolent movements or civil resistance in the context of countering violent extremism?
Great. It's a very good question, and it's funny. I watched a debate once between someone who had been part of a violent terrorist group, and his argument was, this is totally based on context. You know, sure, you outsiders can tell me whatever you think, but how I got involved, I will only listen once I'm involved to someone in my context. And then other people were saying, no, this is a totally generalizable phenomenon that happens everywhere, and actually, and there was this dialogue there, and like, both sides were kind of right. But I think we do have to recognize the fundamentally local nature of these processes of involvement. And for that reason, so much of my thought process about the role of externals would truly be trying to provide whatever resources are needed by people who are deeply familiar in that context to try to articulate what that alternative is in terms that will make sense and resonate. So what are some terms that might make sense? One is to simply be able to talk about the discrepancy in efficacy. When you choose violent extremism, you are choosing a path that has actually a very low probability of success. Most people don't know that. And not everyone is persuaded by percentages, but fortunately we don't just have one argument that can be made, but that's one of many. Another is the fact that I think we really do need to, and again, this is something that people in a local context will need to think about, what symbols, values, and narratives and stories are going to resonate best, to make the case that actually there's a big psychological payoff to being involved in nonviolent action, which we've just discussed. Far greater participation, particularly for women, elders, children, and others, sense of belonging, community, empowerment. And then I also think that cases and cultural stories need to be reclaimed, retold, reinterpreted. I would note, for example, that in Pakistan, they had, Gandhi looked up to Badshah Khan. Badshah Khan was known as the frontier Gandhi. He was Pashtun. He was in what, at that time, British Northwest Frontier Province in the 1930s and created the first, to my knowledge, nonviolent army called the Khuda Khidmatgar. And they had an oath that they took. They wore uniforms, they did drills, they did service, and that history is not, based on what I've heard, widely taught in Pakistan. In fact, post-independence, Badshah Khan was thrown in jail. And so how many other stories are there, particularly also of women, and and the methods that they have chosen in light of cultural oppression that has been experienced for decades or generations in various contexts around the world, and employed nonviolent action and not necessarily use those terms. Those stories need to be re-elevated so that people can see that when they march, when they take action, they're operating completely within a context that is theirs, that they own. I would point out that even in the United States we have this problem where when people think about various acts of non-cooperation done even by colonists against the British, non-importation of British goods, boycotts and so forth, we don't think of it as, they were doing nonviolent action in 1765, but they were. This history gets lost unless we name it and take it back. A couple other points. I think we really need to elevate ongoing movements today. For example, the Pashtun protection movement going on in Pakistan right now, and other places as examples. And Niloufar has also raised examples. I think we can make arguments based on religion, as Martin Luther King, Gandhi, the Dalai Lama, and others have. I have a good friend, Archibald Ahmadullah, who Maria introduced me to in Afghanistan, who also has created a whole PowerPoint and presentation around Islam and nonviolent action. And last point would be terminology. And the terminology really matters here. Nonviolent action is not the term that resonates with a lot of people, right? So political defiance might, people power might. I think this is best summed up in a quote, which some of you may have heard before, but I think it's just so illustrative. And so I'll read this quote and I'll stop there. And this is a quote from Walter Wink, who is an American theologian who went to South Africa in the 1980s and interviewed people about what was working. And so he writes, "What we found most surprising is that a great many of the people simply do not know how to name their actual experiences with nonviolence. When asked about using the term nonviolent action as a form of resistance to apartheid, Wink was told, quote, 'We tried that for 50 years and it didn't work. Violence is the only way left.' But when Wink asked South Africans what resistance methods had been most effective in the previous 2 years, quote, they produced a remarkably long list of nonviolent actions: labor strikes, slowdowns, sit-downs, stoppages, and stayaways, bus boycotts, consumer boycotts, and school boycotts, funeral demonstrations, non-cooperation with government functionaries, non-payment of rent, violation of government bans on peaceful meetings, defiance of segregation orders on beaches and restaurants, theaters and hotels, shunning of black police and soldiers. This amounts to what is probably the largest grassroots eruption of diverse nonviolent methods in a single struggle in human history. Yet these students and many others we interviewed, both black and white, failed to identify these tactics as nonviolent and even bridled at the word. We have a marketing challenge, but it's totally possible to meet it. And if I'm an external actor thinking about this, I'm thinking about how I can provide whatever resources are needed for locals to make the argument in a way that makes sense for them.
Great. Thanks very much, Hardy. That was compelling. And Niloufar, what would be most helpful in the situation in Afghanistan now to elevate the grassroots movement?
Well, I recently had completed a research on human security in Afghanistan, and interviewed people of different ages about what makes you productive, what makes you constructive, what makes you do a non-violent, any kind of activity to bring a positive change. So most of the result of my research show that, which is kind of very relevant to what should be done in this particular case, is that religion and sense of patriotism are two major factors that drive people for collective movement, positive change, and more, and drives them to be more productive, positive, and step in positive actions. So I think goes back to what Hardy said about the other countries. Really, people still, it's a 99% Muslim country. People still take many of their social norms and their daily guidelines from Islamic teachings. So based on, again, my interviews, whatever question I was asking, most of the interviewees, they were reflecting on religion inspires us, religion guides us. So they were the words they were using. Religion gives us positive motivation. Religion gives us more energy. And any situation, even the situation is worse, we motivate by these religious verses. So I think, and many of international organizations has been targeting already, including USIP, to have a peace education through religious clerics, mullahs, elders, whoever, and which has been proved very positively. So I think that's one thing. The second factor in Afghanistan has been dependent on foreign aids and foreign support for many, many years now. It's I was reading the history, it's almost a century. And it has been occupied mostly by outsiders. So this occupation and foreign intervention give a sense that this country is not ours. This country is a place of battle. This country will never have any stability because this is international powers will have their whatever interest they have, they come here. And this particular notion in minds of every individual, it has lost the concept of patriotism, the feeling of patriotism to do something positively. That's why, I mean, whenever some pressure is coming, everyone leaves the country. So I think this has to be built, I mean, for thinking that this is their land and they have to make it. And if they are making it, they have to collectively think about it. So from international perspective, from international support perspective, I think there has been, first of all, working in this two notion is important through this two area, whatever the activities could be focused on. Second is to stay at the back picture whenever nonviolent movements are happening. For example, funding a protest or funding a movement and then using, and by the name of, let's say, well, whoever donor or whoever country is that could not be productive in sustaining the movement, whatever the nonviolent movement is. It might go for 1 or 2 days, but the sustaining of it will not be ensured if and there will be international linkages to that particular movement. And we have seen a lot of movements since 2011, which has broken down after 2-3 days, and then nobody even, and then communities did not join. They said, well, it was supported by ABC countries, and it was a particular agenda. It's not people's movement. It's not people-centered. It does not respond to our grievances. So the movement broke up because of this international direct linkages as donor. So that angle, angle should be, I think, considered seriously while supporting the indigenous movement, especially during peace processes, especially in context of Afghanistan, because so many actors right now are involved in peace processes in Afghanistan, starting from North, Russia, China, Pakistan, Iran, all are the players, all have interest. United States, Europe, everyone is right now there at the table of negotiation, have something to say and something to do. Saudis, so for such a peace process can easily be hijacked. A community collective movement can easily be hijacked. So this is a tricky thing to consider, but at least from my perspective and from the experience I have seen throughout, that it's good for international to remain as much as possible as a supporter outside, sort of showing their faces or their presence to the movement directly.
Very helpful cautionary note when it comes to external support to grassroots movements. Leanne, how about you? What would you advise policymakers?
Hardy mentioned in his opening framing that like no one size fits all, but if we could get this to help at least a part of it, 10%, we'd be in a really good spot. So I'm going to go along on those lines first and foremost, which is appreciating that these are very complex. The places where violent extremism manifests most violently are really complex systems in which we have to understand the interplay between a lot of different actors, factors, interventions, and systems challenges. And so thinking of nonviolent resistance as one of many things that's happening in that space, I think is a helpful inject in and of itself into the policy space. The second thing, and this is picking up on what Nilüfer was saying, is for me, what would be helpful for policymakers to understand with regard to nonviolent resistance is that national level governments can play a helpful role by using their diplomatic efforts to create this space for locally driven movements to take hold. And so whether that's through the training of security forces to understand the difference of how to police a boycott or so it doesn't become a riot, those are like the type of skill sets that I think policymakers should be thinking about as helping counter terrorism. Because if people find a space in their nonviolent movement, chances are they're not also finding a space in a violent extremist movement. And so preserving that space from a policy level from the government side, I think would be an important lesson here. The last lesson that I would say, and this was from my opening remarks as well, is really trying to think about how policymakers can understand locally driven agendas. What are the grievances that people are experiencing in their own words, not as observed by outsiders, and how they would like to go about changing them in their own actions, not defined by outsiders. I think nonviolent resistance can teach the CVE community a lot about, frankly, the non-interference side of what could be most useful here. I just think that really preserves the agency and dignity that a lot terrorist groups promise, never deliver on. So this is another thing in that marketing space. Terrorist groups promise that individuals are going to have agency and dignity. They never deliver on that. That's part of the recruitment. But once you're actually in the system, you are told exactly what to do. It is incredibly fascist and totalitarian once you're actually in it. And so if nonviolent groups can actually say, not only are we promising you the agency and dignity, but you're actually going to get to deliver on that agency and dignity, that's a huge win in this space. And so I think if policymakers around the world can see it in those lenses, I think it'd be really useful. I'm going to put one asterisk of caution on this because I'm such an optimist about this, but I'll be realistic for like 2 seconds, which is nonviolent resistance and terrorism have something in common, and they're trying to change the power dynamics in a given system. And so elites that don't want to give up their power and are entrenched with whether it be through corruption or a variety of different other efforts are going to find both of these things threatening for very, very different ways. And so if that is part of policymakers' understanding of a situation, again, informed by localized knowledge and definition, but I do think that it's not always going to be the easiest thing to palate for a lot of policymakers because of that.
Excellent point. Hardy, did you want to respond? Yeah.
No, just a shout out, because as I talk and as I hear others talk, I'm thinking about resources online that you can grab if you want to. And so when we're talking about the role of external actors in supporting movements, Maria co-authored a really great piece that's downloadable called Aid to Civil Society, A Movement Mindset. If you Google movement mindset, it'll be top of the list. That niche in the internet is still up for grabs, and Maria grabbed it. So Aid to Civil Society, Movement Mindset is a great resource to start to orient around how externals can help movements.
Right. Any other questions you had for each other before we turn it over to the audience? All right. We have plenty of time for a discussion with you all. So why don't we start in the very far, I think, are we responsible for?
Yeah, here, I'll just have a roll.
Okay.
My name is Amal, and I'm from Pakistan. So first of all, we should differentiate between the donor initiatives, peace initiatives, and the social movements. the indigenous social movements. There are differences. The indigenous social movements, they have their own dynamics. The degree of level of ownership is different. The level of commitment is different. While in donor-initiated initiatives, I think Ms. Nilofer, also touch upon the, foreign-funded peace initiatives. Let me share with you my own experience. I was invited in one of the best places in Pakistan. It's one of the 5-star hotel to deliver talk on peace with the Afghans. They were brought from Kabul, from different area of Afghanistan, and there was 1 week training, peace building training on peace building. So I commit a great sin when I said that, when I was explaining the negative piece, I said that during Taliban time, there was a negative piece. So the participants, they did not minded it. When we were talking in the break, they were in dialogue with me. But the donor, they told me, why you mentioned the Taliban name? If you are running a peace building project, peace building program for the Afghans, then you did not mention the Taliban, so you can judge how will be the fate of such initiative. Second thing is that the Ilmen peace process, the Ilmen peace march. I think we should not forget one another aspect which Adi has mentioned. PTM, Pashtun Tahfuz movement, who started sit-in Islamabad in January. So there will be another triggers also for the Ilmen peace process. But one of the influencing factor is the same Pashtun movement in Islamabad, which started from the Pashtun belt, Pashtun tribal areas, conflict areas, and now it's become a headache for the Pakistani state. Why? Because it's a non-violent. They are raising the issues which are faced by the ordinary people in the conflict zone. All the demands, they are mainly related with the security forces, because they are pointing at the gross human violation of the security forces in the tribal area. The third thing which I want to bring in your notice is that, sometime I can give you many examples when there are there are social movements, but when the donors started funding it, so it creates conflict within the organization, within the movements. So whenever the donors and international community want to support these movements, so they should keep it in mind that their internal dynamics should not be disturbed. Their spontaneity, their local closeness, or local sensitivities which they know, they should be kept in mind. Otherwise, we will. Yes, I know. Now, security and the peace building are two profitable business in the world. Yes, we should accept this reality. Thank you.
No, those are really great points, and just highlighting the challenges of external support to movements is really, really important. Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm Chhatra from Nepal. Of course, Nepal's peace building or Nepal's state, what we are at present may not be that important, but it is important for us. So my question is, what has been happening? We had Maoist insurgency for 10 years. And then it took 9 years for the government to form the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and Commission for the Forcibly Disappeared. And it has been 3 years since, and still those who are affected, those who have been wounded, they are still hurting. They are still crying. And we, as the organization who help these people, we bring them together. There's a dialogue, and then promise, and then nothing happens. It is a time again and again. And so I asked someone from the external agency that there is impunity Because people, when you find someone who has murdered your husband and raped your wife or your mother and scotted free, and due to pressures and all that, that person was, and he was the member of parliament, can you imagine? And he was roaming freely, but police won't find him. He was in the absent sort of list. And somehow he was captured. And then within a few days, they started in the political arena, they wanted to free him and all that. And finally, the president, it is a lady president, mind you, and she pardoned him. That is one just example. There are others who are scotting free. And how do we sort of, give solace to those people who are still hurting and wounded? And I asked someone from the external this thing that, can't the international agency do something to bring the accountability of the Nepal government? And they said, it is your private business, It's nothing to do with us. It is your local politics. So my question to you, sir and madam, is whether it is a local politics, local business, or whether the international community has some responsibility to make the government accountable.
Good question. So, would you want to start first, or no?
To my friend in the back, thank you for your comments. I want to just talk about the third thing that you said, which is about external support. And I think my organization does limited funding. Most of what we do is programs, but we also write grants. Small is beautiful when it comes to grant size and movements. Small, experimental, local, targeted. It's very interesting. If I want to write big grants, it's easier for me to write. If I want to write a $100,000 grant to a big established organization, it's not that much work for my staff. If I want to distribute $100,000 in $8,000 to $10,000 increments to movements, it's incredibly time and staff intensive. We have to make sure we trust and know the local context in every single place very well before we give the grant. We have to fully understand that they will not have the infrastructure to report in certain ways that we would expect a big NGO to do. I have to have my board's support that I'm not going to be able to show them the same metrics and data that they might want. So I have to make sure that my board agrees with my approach, that they're going to be satisfied, that they're not going to have the same kind of deliverable as for a big organization. And I have to put a ton of staff time into doing it, and the grant size at the end of the day is actually quite small. And it comes, for me, from my view that money is not the thing that makes movements work generally. So money, we tend to think, well, if we want to empower an organization, you can throw money at it. It might work. It has an infrastructure to absorb that money, and at a minimum, it can hire more staff, assuming it, But a movement can't hire more people to support it. The whole basis is voluntary participation and people feeling it's legitimate. So you throw money at it, you can create divisions and all kinds of problems. And so I just wanted to highlight that point and agree with you and just share a minute about my approach and thinking about it. Is what's really the challenge movements face is partly one of yes, they have the local knowledge. Now, is there a way as external actors that we can bring to them information, resources, and external connections that they may not have? How can I connect dissidents against corruption in Southern Africa with dissidents struggling against corruption in Southeast Asia so they can learn from each other? That, to me, is a great example of external actor support. And then on the Nepal question, I'm careful about staying in my lane, and my lane is movements and not as much transitional justice. So I fear that if I start trying to respond to your question, which I think is a really great one, I'm going to end up saying something stupid, and that people in this audience probably know a lot more about transitional justice practices than I do. And so in addition to the panel, if any others have comments, I would say this. I don't know of any government process that's going to be really effective at dealing with the kind of stuff you do, whether it's internationally imposed or nationally imposed, unless there is a major grassroots component. Because if it becomes a legalistic process about who can testify and who can't and who has access and who doesn't, chances are it's going to come from the top, and the psychological healing that needs to happen will not happen. So just as the most generic sense, whatever process may be designed would have to have a major bottom-up participatory component where access is granted to people from all walks of life to feed into that process and witness that process, instead of something that happens over there in the Capitol in a bunch of, buildings with tight access.
Great. My co-panelists want to address either the first interjection or the question about Nepal.
In regard to amnesty, the transitional justice, I would like to share experience of Afghanistan, which has been a total failure. Transitional justice process started in 2003 or 4 onwards, and then it took almost 3 years. Government has its own plan. International community has had its own plan. Human Rights Commission Office, independent commission started working on an action plan for transitional justice, which all proved to be completely failure. Why? Because in the second round of election, all the perpetrators of war, they were in power. And it was very, very difficult to oppose them when they were having the power position in the cabinet and soon in the parliament. Most of them are in the parliament. So I think I go for what Hardy mentioned, that even the collection of data happened from communities and from people to just show up the more evidences about these perpetrators of what they have done and report more. But the report was not released. There was a huge funding by Center for Transitional Justice to collect that data. It happened, 3 years project, Human Rights Commission did it, but the release of the product was so problematic and it never released. Why? Because these perpetrators were in power. So I think for such initiatives, especially when they come in power position, it would be very difficult to oppose them and release any information against them, especially if you want. And they are seeking amnesty, through different procedure, which in Afghanistan case it happened regarding these warlords. So I would agree with what Hardy said, that it's a long-term process of people's engagement and people's process against them to see if that would result. I don't have any answer for that, but I think for what happened in Afghanistan, I think it makes more sense to engage more and more communities and people from ground.
They've been there for 17 years.
Yeah.
It's still hopeful.
Still hopeful, yeah.
The only thing that I would add on the transitional justice front is that impunity as a sanctioned social behavior is really dangerous, not just for those involved in experiencing the impunity today, but from a long-term recruitment and radicalization challenge, and places where people feel like injustices and impunity are rampant, where it's like kindling waiting for a fire in terms of radicalization and recruitment. And to me, in places where there are judicial processes and where accountability can be done either through traditional or legalistic means, that it's incredibly important for international actors, national actors, local actors to think about this not just for the moment in time, but for the social aspect of impunity not being a cultural norm in the places where it exists.
Good point. Other questions?
Hi. So I have a question. We talked about policy, external policy people and how they can support local movements. But I see a lot of danger with the media adopting a pet social movement in the West or outside and elevating it to this historic, the heroic narrative that isn't actually what's happening on the ground. And how do we get hold of that? Because I think that's incredibly damaging to local social movements. And have you all done any research on that?
Great question. So the artificial elevation of one movement or component of a movement that could actually undermine grassroots mobilizing.
Want to start from that side first?
Leanne.
So from the terrorism perspective, the artificial elevation is actually quite a good thing for terrorist organizations. They love to be artificially elevated. The more power that they can be seen, the better it is for them. In places where efficacy is actually part of what a group is trying to do, I think the expectation gap can be really dangerous. And I'll let those who actually study this, who are gathering their thoughts, talk a little bit more about it. But if we are thinking about nonviolent resistance as a potential competitor toward violent extremism, there probably is a creative way to have, whether it's media or journalists or others think about elevating nonviolent movements generally, but not in the specific case. So the marketability of this as a process and not unintentionally cutting out the knees of a movement that really didn't need all these expectation gaps in it. But that's just the off the top of my head part of it, and I hope others have maybe gathered their thoughts who are more professional on this.
I've gathered my thoughts. Yes, I'm the professional activist. Nice to meet you all. I have a degree in activism.
Where's your card?
Yeah.
You got a union card?
Absolutely, check me on LinkedIn. So the thing is like, so I can't tell journalists not to show up, right? They're just going to do what they do. So like, this is just a fact. I mean, okay, information environments vary dramatically. In a closed information environment, the journalists won't show up. Or they might, or whatever. Like but it's not something that's easy for a movement to control. So given that it can happen, how does a movement prepare for it, since it may not be preventable?
Yeah, exactly.
And I think of a few things. So the first is, not every movement has the benefit to do this, but to the extent that a movement can incubate and try to build a culture of shared principles. This is who we are. This is how we talk about what we do. These are our principles of how we make decisions and how we engage. To the extent that they can incubate for a while before and frankly, that incubation period is a very boring period from a media perspective, right? Oh, a bunch of people talking, a bunch of people doing local level initiatives. Not that interesting, but so important, right? Because by the time a movement gets larger and goes exponential and gets lots of people showing up this is my first experience with activism. I just showed up here. My friend invited me. By the time it gets to that point, you can't create that culture anymore. It's people showing up, stuff's happening. So you incubate the culture, you front load that culture is to the best you can. And doesn't just help you strategically. It doesn't just help you in terms of trying to maintain nonviolent discipline and messaging. It really helps you when that media storm comes. One of the things that activists in the United States do, which I think is really smart, draws from Marshall Gans. So Marshall Gans talks about the story of self. Now, it's interesting, right? You could have, I know people who have done media, obviously, for political candidates. And that skill set is not necessarily totally cross-applicable to activists. It's because if I'm the press person for candidate A, guess what? You want the message? You got to talk to candidate A. But hey, if you all are protesters and I'm the media person and I show up and maybe I have an agenda, I'd like you to delegitimize you a little bit. I find the person who I think is most likely to be outside the mainstream, and let's interview them about what they think. And so one of the ways to inoculate against this is to train your people a little bit on your own narrative. Why are you here? What brought you here? That soundbite, that story, if it's prepared and worked on, can be enormously effective. And guess what? Most people like to figure out how to tell their story. So it's not like we're going to train you what to say when people ask you what we're about. We're going to take you through a process of discovering why you're here and then learning to articulate it in a really smart way. People love that. It makes sense. It's good. It builds sharing and cohesion, and it helps with that media storm. The last thing I'll say, and then I'll stop, is movements need to be careful not to gauge their success based on media coverage. It will come, it will go, it is not in your control. And the minute you slip, those journalists that raised you up may start writing stories about your demise. So the question for a movement is, how do you define success? What are your metrics? It may take years to get the policy or other change you want. Do not base it on media coverage. Don't even necessarily base it on, did we get the policy change we want yet? Find other metrics. Are we more united than we were last year? Do we have better strategic capacity? Are we more disciplined? Other metrics that you can control about how you function can be really helpful, so that the media may come and go, but you still have a sense of where you're at.
That's great. All great points. Other questions?
My question isn't so much about violent extremism, but more about the effectiveness of resistance versus like other methods that are maybe like more working within a system. And I'm a researcher tracking the implementation of the Colombian peace process. And in worldwide, everybody was so excited that so much gender inclusion language was in the Colombian peace process. But as a researcher that's tracking implementation of those very commitments, it's pretty low how much it's being implemented. And for me, it really raises the question of, if a civil society group is trying to push X agenda, is it more effective to try and negotiate that be in a peace agreement, or to do more, or does that dull their impact, trying to institutionalize their mission? And so I was just thinking about that as you were talking about the Afghanistan peace process, and also Leanne's comments about, this really like mobilizations actually really addressing the power issues, and the people at the top aren't going to like that. I'm just interested in your thoughts.
Good question. So the institutionalization of kind of these certain gender and other issues, and kind of when is it effective and what are the challenges?
From international organization perspective, the reaction has been very project-based. So not really helped an institutionalization of peace process itself, and institutionalization of gender in peace process as well. Yes, there was, from UN 1325 has been proven to be successful in certain areas, but we have seen throughout this period that the programs were not able to really institutionalize the concept of women and peace settlement or peace negotiation with Taliban, because we have seen in Qatar that whatever any kind of talks between Taliban and the government happened or not happened, there were not any women representative there. At High Peace Council, there was an effort toward institutionalization of women in peace processes, but again, it did not really happen very well because of the different factions who were kind of opposing more participation of women in the peace process. So overall, my impression is maybe there has been tries or efforts, but no, it hasn't been institutionalized yet. Women are still not at the senior talks whenever it's happening. And last month there was a huge push by the women groups, women civil society groups from Kabul and around the country, that why we are not at the talks, because there was a track 2 meeting happening somewhere. And then the Moscow process was there, and women were not invited, women were not in the process, which created a lot of activism within the country against that efforts. So fortunately, there has been a lot of efforts, yes, from the UN and international organizations and donors to bring more women, at least make their participation happen. But the meaningful participation, as I think, is still lacking in the peace processes in Afghanistan. Yeah, based on the quota system, you might see women faces in the High Peace Council or here and there at the meetings, but exactly whenever there's a serious discussion, we haven't seen their role is still very prominent.
I have a couple non-sequential thoughts on this. And I actually don't have a thought on your main question, which is the efficacy of inside the process versus outside the process pieces. But on the gendered aspect of it, I'm going to use this opportunity to kind of talk about, because I didn't mention it all, about gender and violent extremism and how terrorist groups have been using gendered language for a really, really long time on how to problematize the other and how to reify masculinity. And I think that there's a lot for us in the community to understand how they are doing this, and it's not a women at the table problem, although I think that's an incredibly important vector, and I'm not disparaging it, but the way in which masculinity and gender particularly is used in the radicalization and recruitment process of a lot of these predominantly male groups is a really interesting space for international policymakers, practitioners, and researchers to be thinking about. And I think that there is more and more experiences from formers, particularly, that are coming out, whether it's formers from a variety of different groups all around the world, that is confirming, when looked through the eyes of a sociologist or an anthropologist, or people who are kind of looking a little bit differently at these gendered language, particularly in the recruitment and in the staying in the group. I think there's a big there, and so I will tote. USIP just recently put out a new gender framework. It's on our website. It's really just an interesting lens to which to understand the problem, but I think that it will help a lot of us who are really focused, again, on the implementation, on the solving of these challenges, to understand how gendered some of these groups really are.
And just on the peace process one as well, I would just flag the resource. Some of you may not be aware of a great report that ICNC supported, which was Veronique Dudouay's report called Powering to Peace. Now, what exactly is after the colon? Powering to Peace.
I don't remember.
Oh ICNC marketing fail right here. No, but it's Veronique Dudouay, Powering to Peace, and she really gets at the idea of the relationship between kind of bottom-up people power and peace processes, and has a lot of good examples. And so I would flag that for those specifically interested in kind of this relationship, which also is something we're trying to explore more at the Institute.
I think it's integrating civil resistance and peace-building strategies. That's what's after the call. So, yes.
And just what to do then? Yes, the question is what to do. Is that I think peace process, it's a process, and all of us, I'm sure sitting here, that we believe that peace is not really an event. You know, it's not a one-time, 1 year, 2 year, 3 years project. It should be a process, and we all in Afghanistan also, we have been advocating that please treat peace as a process, not as a project. And unfortunately in Afghanistan, there's all the women's rights issue, it has been politicized, the peace process itself now is treated, even now it's treated as a project, you know. Let's finish it, done, and do a settlement, political settlement, and that's it. So what happened after settlement? Do you think it's gonna be peaceful or no? So I think there's treating peace even from local perspective, I mean locally even, local organizations, government of Afghanistan, civil society, they should really believe that it's a process of us. It might take 50 years, just like other countries. So let's accept it. It might take 50 years. So we have to, for institutionalization of issues like that, you cannot expect within 4 or 5 years that you should institutionalize gender, or you should institutionalize the concept of nonviolence in a country which has been involved for 50 years, right? So this all needs to be embedded in every social norms of society, a culture, political culture of society, which takes years, and it has to be accepted within the country first, and also within whoever supports the process in general.
So we've got less than 10 minutes left. Why don't we take even got the paper here. Why don't we take a couple questions from the audience?
So Lauren Van Meter and I work at National Democratic Institute, and one of the things you spoke about donors and the donor problem is, you know, we do a lot of work around the CVE, PV work in terms of participatory governance, but increasingly donors are looking at even that as radicalization of youth because of the overall objective to reform or refine government. So you spoke a little bit about language. How do we push back on this idea? Because of radicalization. I mean, some of what they're proposing is in the mind of the state and the mind of donors radical. So what words do you use for that? And then second, the issue that you raised, Leanne, which is exactly how do you convince donors that this is a positive process, even though the end result may look the same? Does that make sense?
Can you rephrase the first question? I just want to make sure I get it totally.
Well, they talk about, there's sort of a closing of the aperture around the idea of radicalization that is becoming smaller and smaller, right? So how do you push back on that idea with donors, that participatory governance, civil resistance are not the radicalization of youth?
You mean to say like they're lumping in nonviolent civil resistance
Yes.
as a radical?
As radicalization.
Yes.
Right.
Okay. Should we go? I think so. So it's interesting. The common denominator is disruption, right? Nonviolent civil resistance creates disruption, as does violence. And if your metric, and particularly if you have a military background and one of your metrics is stabilization, then generically you're looking at lack of stability either way, in the most abstract sense, right? But that's where the similarities stop. Because when we say, okay, fine, there is destabilization, but then we look at what's the cause of destabilization, you see completely divergent outcomes, right? You see one form of stabilization, one form of instability or disruption in the short term has a great prospect of leading to longer term stability, while the other just goes the opposite direction. And I think part of it is sensitizing and training, and I don't think our diplomats or military personnel or others get sufficient training in understanding the virtues and power of grassroots movements. I don't think they understand them. I think they're used to thinking of organizations and hierarchies and things that can be controlled through knowing who's at the top. I think an indigenous grassroots phenomenon is very challenging for them to wrap their heads around. They don't know where to push or what to push, who to talk to. And I also think they're not familiar with some of the most amazing research that's been done over the last 10 years about the absolute critical role that movements play in building rights and democracy and good governance and transparency. I mean, when we think just in our own country, this is something I do sometimes, particularly with people in the U.S. policy community, about achievements of which we are most proud, whether it's the 40-hour work week, to the extent that that even exists anymore, especially in this town, but nonetheless, the end of child labor, the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act, the fact that we don't have over 1,000 nuclear power plants all over this country. How did we get HIV/AIDS on the agenda of the 1980s, and so on and so forth? Again and again, women's suffrage. How could I overlook it? It came about through these efforts, and yet we shouldn't. So in a sense, they're not exceptional. They're actually predictable. They happen regularly when things get out of whack and institutions are unbalanced. And for those who think have been trained in a worldview that if we just know who's at the top of the pyramid, we negotiate with them, they're just missing it. And so, sorry, I don't mean to get on a soapbox there, but it is a question of sensitivity for people to understand, and I think they're not adequately equipped to fully get it. If we look at the number of new movements going on, what we're seeing, if you just count movements directly challenging governments trying to get a political transition, there are about 28 new movements in the 1990s. That was about 53 in 2010. We're on track for nearly 100 in this decade. So it's doubling every decade. And what's the policy community doing to keep up?
Great. Do any others have points on that?
I'll share a generalized anecdote. Some of the most difficult conversations I ever had when I was working at the State Department and in diplomatic conversations that either I or I was witness to were trying to make the exact distinction that Hardy started out with, that this disruption, that nonviolent civil disruption is categorically different than violent extremism, and that if you close the space for A, you're gonna have more B. And it is a very difficult conversation that if I could just advocate for us continuing to have around the world, that for all of the reasons that Hardy was talking about, the U.S.'s most proud moments have included category A, that we continue to not be blinded by a lot of places that haven't had so many category A's and are fearful of it. They're fearful of the power shift that may occur with it. But I think that there's just a huge impetus to continue to do it. And it's really, really difficult. And so the more things that we have that are like data or toolkits, or the stronger that we can reinforce these arguments so that we're not putting our diplomats, our military personnel, or others in like vastly, vastly uncomfortable situations in which they can't actually talk the high road. I think that it's a very real phenomenon. So I don't mean to diminish it, but I think sometimes we shy away from really, really difficult conversations, but particularly at the like expert levels and mid-levels in diplomatic communities, these should be happening. The kind of friends don't let friends drive drunk conversation. And I think that the more that those can happen now, you might see some more impacts later as those people rise through the ranks of their own governments.
I love it. Debunking disruption. All right, we have time for one more question, and then we'll wrap. Thank you.
So hi. So I don't work with violent extremism, but have done work in places where there is violent extremism, particularly in Nigeria, and had the opportunity a few years ago to spend some time talking with members of Boko Haram from Nigeria, and had an opportunity to hear their grievances and go tying back to your original. And what really impressed me during this conversation was that these were incredibly educated young men whose grievance was that they were educated but didn't have opportunity for fulfilling in their life. And I had opportunity after that to talk to some people in politics, particularly Olusegun Obasanjo, who had talked with these before when the forming. And his comment to me, which really resonated with me, was that these young men will find meaning, and that their recruitment into extremism was because of the failure of the economy to provide them with meaningful employment. So I guess my comment or my question is, to what extent can we use nonviolent to deal with some of those root causes, which may actually be disrupting to the government, which is being reinforced by the process which is enabling the extremism. The inequality of wealth and the concentration of wealth and the economic system that's driving that.
So why don't we end with each of you offering 30 seconds that both addresses that question and offers a synopsis of your final points.
What I think nonviolent resistance offers to that type of situation, but more generalizable, is that there's an identified grievance, which is the economic inequality, and what nonviolent resistance offers is that people can take that into their own hands and chart their own ability to change that in their government. That it's not the United States recognizing that grievance and telling the Nigerian government, you have to do something about your inequality problem, which I think is fair for the governments to do. But that's not the crux of why it's getting changed. Why it's getting changed is individuals are able to address it for themselves. And so I think that that's a really different paradigm shift for those who focus a lot on violent extremism. It's identification of grievance and then fix the grievance, as opposed to let others identify the grievance and let others tell you how they can fix the grievance, because there is space in their community to nonviolently organize around it.
In Afghanistan in 2005, there was a report on Kandahar that group of people, they joined Taliban, and then there was an interview with those people. Why did you join Taliban? Because they were normal community people. So based on the research product, it was shown that most of the community people in Kandahar, they joined Taliban insurgency because government of Afghanistan salary is $50, and Taliban group used to pay $300 per month. So just because of the salary differences, and certainly they could not afford to pay their all house expenses with $50. So based on the interviews responses, they joined because of Taliban were paying more. So responding to grievances, certainly, I mean, and mostly we have seen in Afghanistan that people are joining insurgencies from the poor areas more than the other well-advanced areas. So. In that regard, the governments, I think, I would see the government of Afghanistan or the government of any country, if they could be able to identify those particular challenges or grievances that every community has and respond them. Overall, I think my own take about the peace processes, especially since, peace process happening in a country where I lived and I worked for long years, I think overall, beyond the issue of the topic of this particular event today, is economic development and education. I think I would see as two important pillars and two important ways to ensure sustainable peace. Education, whatever, for example, right now, we need peace education throughout different communities. It could be through media or through education institution, what peace is, what violence is, or what nonviolence is, or what prevention should be used. Very normal, basic terminologies that some context they don't know about it. I think it has to be spreaded. It has to be people should be sensitized from remote areas, and it can change the norms. It can change certain unwanted norms within those societies that can help and cooperate with the peace process. I think that is one of the tactics. So education as a tactic could be used in order to enhance peace processes throughout the country. And overall, in a context that I worked, poverty itself has given rise to instability and insurgency in the country during all these years of peace process. So poverty has a strong impact on on rising the insurgency level or lowering the insurgency level. Economically well-developed provinces in Afghanistan, you can see less insurgency, less conflict, less crimes there. But in a very less educated provinces, you can see more conflict, more insurgency, and more suicide attacks or whatever form of insecurity is there. So I mean, based on what we have seen, that these two elements are playing a major role in the entire peace processes, which has to be addressed at some point. Difficult task, but needs to be addressed.
Excellent. Hardy, bring us home. 10 seconds.
So 10 seconds. Let's go back to where we started with the 10%. If we've got 10% of the solution, I'm giving ourselves an A. So you're talking about young men who feel a lack of economic opportunity and agency. Solution to that might be to get them jobs. And if there is just pure economic policy-based top-down way to do it, great. Unfortunately, most of the time there's not. So I don't see civil resistance as the solution to every problem, but I do see it once corruption gets involved and becomes part of the reason why they don't have jobs. Like a universal truth about corruption, I've never seen corruption get better by itself. I've even seen regimes decide, okay, we're taking this authoritarianism thing a little too far, let's pull back. I have never seen corruption be someone be like, you know what, we're just a little too corrupt, let's start. No, does not work. And I think we know that based on what we're seeing in DC as well. It just never burns itself out. Even violence can burn itself out, corruption doesn't. And so on that issue alone, you can start to argue for why civil resistance is needed and necessary. The other thing, and I'll just stop here, if you're going to communicate with someone, it's really important to know the story they tell about themselves first. People listen when they feel that they've been listened to, and they don't listen when they don't feel they've been listened to. So those young men you talked about, or anyone else we're talking about, reaching a message, marketing anything, unless we understand the story that they tell about themselves, and start the conversation by saying, my understanding is you feel X, Y, and Z. You know, it's really hard to get any uptake at all. And so to come back to some of these ideas about the rationality of why people are doing things, even things that we find egregious, the importance of understanding that narrative as the entry point to trying to shift anything, I think is critical.
All right. Well, I don't know about you. I found this to be a fascinating conversation. Please join me in thanking the panelists.